All right. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, my embrace family, and welcome back to our weekly Wednesday discussion where we're going over the book written by Imam Jamil Al-Amin, Revolution by the Book. And just a quick reminder for those of you who are joining us for the first time for this discussion, we are going over this book that was written by Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, a civil rights advocate during the 1950s and 1960s, who eventually embraced Islam and helped transform his community in Atlanta, Georgia, into help transport it for the better, so to speak, a community of believers in a community that brought khair and brought goodness to society. And he wrote this book back in the 1990s. And through this book, he explains how, through the core principles of Islam, one can bring about change to their community and have a true movement for the betterment of society. Last week we discussed chapters one and two, which went over the first pillar, which is the Shahada, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, that there is no deity worship Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. How that understanding prepares one for creating a movement. And then chapter two discussed, of course, the second pillar, Salat, the prayer. He specifically focused on the communal prayer and how through the communal prayer it helps believers become more focused and stuff are kind of the building blocks to establishing a community. And so this week we'll be going over chapters 3 and 4, starting with chapter 3. And chapter 3, as he continues, he starts with the next pillar of Islam, which is zakat. Um, he begins the chapter with just a brief explanation of zakat, what that means. Of course, we know that zakat is the giving of obligatory charity, 2.5% of one's material wealth. He discusses the meaning of it. Of course, zakat being giving charity as a means of purifying oneself and one's wealth. He goes over, and from there he starts discussing charity in a more broad sense. He talks about how charity, of course, is and zakat is a form of worship, and how there are different forms of charity. He talks about how charity can be just opening the door for a person. Charity can be um, giving someone a good word. Charity can be a plethora of different things. But so he gives this very brief explanation of zakat, of charity, what charity means in Islam. But then he starts to kind of focus his discussion on charity, right? As we mentioned, the whole purpose of this book is to explain to the reader how Islam's core principles leads a believer and prepares them to start a movement in their faith, right? So he kind of goes back to that factor. So he discusses that charity is, a sense, a form of sacrifice. That's how he defines zakat. Actually, in this particular context, he defines zakat as a form of sacrifice that a believer um, must do, understanding that whatever is given to them does not truly belong to them, but it's something that Allah SWT has given to them, understanding that those who are less fortunate than them have rights upon them from what Allah has given them, and just kind of helps them through continuously giving charity, not just the can, but just the different types of charity. This kind of helps create a habit to the believer, right? And he talks about how, you know, instilling these habits in a believer helps them kind of gain perspective of their purpose in life. And this is where you start speaking about um, how charity is a form of sacrifice. And so he says this, I wanted to read this to all of you. He says, charity, you cannot have an effective social struggle, a successful movement, if you don't have charity. You cannot have a successful revolution if people don't have charity. If you are not willing to sacrifice, sacrifice deals with giving, with sharing those things that Allah places in your trust. What makes us think that we'll be prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, which will be our lives, if we can't sacrifice our property, our wealth? If we cannot give up a little money or a little time that Allah asks of us, and then what makes us think we'll be successful in struggle and the social aspect of struggle? So we see here that Imam Jamil Al-Amin is bringing the discussion back to the importance of struggle and highlights that this is the purpose of those who are believers, those who testify that there is only one creator and they submit themselves to him, that there needs to be a struggle towards the betterment of society and towards upholding this truth of La ilaha illallah, right? And he speaks about economically. He actually, there's one particular point here I found very interesting. He talks about the importance of investing in your community, right? So he makes a quote talking about how it deals with training, it deals with discipline. Again, highlighting the importance that giving charity is a form of discipline, a form of training that's being instilled within the believers to make this a habit for them, and just kind of putting into that perspective the purpose of life. So he says charity is discipline. Charity is a tool which Allah gives us so we can become conscious of struggle. We become conscious of the remembrance of Allah, and we become conscious in such a manner that we understand that certain practices are binding on us in order to bring about necessary change, the revolution that is necessary in ourselves. These practices therefore enable us to be participants in social change that Allah brings about. So again, just kind of linking um, charity to creating a social movement, right? And another interesting point he makes in this chapter is he talks about the importance of investing in one's community, right? So he speaks about, for example, he talks about how when you're in a community, the importance of going to Muslim business, right? He talks about how investing in each other helps a community grow, right? And that in and of itself is a form of charity. Simply going to a Muslim-owned business and helping invest in your fellow believers in order to strengthen the community. And he also talks about, which I found to be very interesting. He speaks about a particular hadith, right? And I kind of want to read this to you guys. What he says. He says that it is necessary at this particular time that we begin to understand movements, that we be conscious of the requirements of movement. The Prophet ﷺ said, in speaking to his companions, related to them a story of some men who embarked on a journey in a boat. He related that there were men on the upper level and there were men on the lower level. He said that in the course of the journey, the men who were on the bottom, because of their thirst, their need, decided to bore a hole in the boat. Now, those of you who joined us for hadith, I actually remember going over this particular hadith, for those who were able to join us. We actually spoke about this hadith and what it means. And he continues by saying that the Prophet ﷺ pointed out that if the people on the upper level did not restrain the people on the lower level, they all would perish. Those people with an understanding of what Allah has commanded must begin to propel their ideals through struggle. Again, highlighting this whole concept of struggle and how charity is a form of creating the habit of struggle and sacrifice in the believers, right? He continues, you must restrain those people who bring about the destruction of this world Allah has put us in, or we shall all perish. To do so is an act of zakat. Now, he says zakat here, but again, remember that Imam Jamil in this particular context is using the word zakat as meaning like sacrifice or charity, right? He's not speaking about it in its technical sense, which of course is giving 2.5% of one's material wealth. He's speaking about it in a more broad understanding, right? And so the question, of course, is why does he bring this up? So he starts speaking about at that particular time, some of the common issues of that particular time. He speaks about global warming. He speaks about how in California there was imminent danger of droughts and famine, and all these other types of issues, right? He's speaking about, again, kind of just bringing it into a more practical aspect. He starts speaking about some of the common issues that were affecting the community at that particular time. And so us in the year 2020, we can understand this in terms of, okay, what are some of the biggest issues facing us right now? Climate change, of course, is still a major issue. Structural racism, as we've spoken about, the continuing growth in inequality between classes of wealth, all these different types of issues, right? And he talks about how it's compulsory upon Muslims to act, to address these issues. It's important in order for us to take that struggle, we need to be active in addressing these issues, right? And that, as Muslims, our goal is not just to stay within our bubble, right? And I've spoken about this in various talks, as most of you know, about how we have these issues in our community where we just kind of live within our own bubble, we keep to ourselves, go to the masjid, have our lectures, pray, and then we don't really get involved outside of the Muslim community, right? But here Imam Jamil is saying that, just as these issues affect the rest of the society, it affects us as well, and we as Muslims have to address these issues. And he mentions that hadith we discussed previously about the people on top and the people on the bottom who were making holes in the boat, and that was causing everyone to be bogged down and affected, right? And so he just mentions the importance of how Muslims need to get involved in the community, not just within our own selves, but in the community as a whole. And another particular theme he has in this chapter that he mentions on a variety of occasions is the importance of changing within oneself. He quotes Allah more than once where Allah says that he has not changed the condition of a people until they change the condition of themselves. He makes this quote multiple times. And he actually makes this quote in previous chapters as well. Just kind of highlighting that in order to make these changes in society, you cannot forget to make the changes within yourself first, right? And he speaks about how a strong community starts with a strong family, the family unit, right? Then he says how a strong family starts with a strong leader, strong family members, those within the family, right? And within this chapter, it's just interesting that he kind of tries to have a balance. He tries to focus that there is a balance between individual growth and individual purification and societal purification, right? You can't have one without the other. And that's where he ends on chapter 3. Now, chapter 4 is titled God's Diet, right? And this chapter I found to be particularly interesting in how he kind of approached it. So basically, he starts the chapter with speaking about fasting, right? The next pillar of this Islam, fasting in the month of Ramadan. Again, he gives us a brief description of fasting, what it means, how fasting is a form of helps one attain, of course, God consciousness, taqwa, and self-restraint, right? And that fasting helps one guard against evil. Right? He discusses these things, but then he starts speaking about fasting on a more practical aspect, right? And this is where I kind of want to focus the discussion on when it comes to chapter 4. So first, he speaks about how fasting helps one gain health and self-restraint, and then he starts talking about how if one really needs to eat 3 square meals a day. He speaks about how if a community was affected by a famine or a drought, which group of people would be best equipped to be strong during that famine? He talks about the believers, those who have been trained to be able to handle being without food or drink, right? And from here, he starts discussing about diet, and he starts talking about digestion, which I found to be very interesting. He starts speaking about how digestion starts in the mouth, how the bacteria within our saliva helps break down the food, and makes it easier for our stomach to digest. Almost like as if you're reading like a science book in a way, right? But of course, there's reason for this. He starts speaking about, of course, processed food. and that there's chemicals in processed food that make it difficult for the bacteria in your mouth to properly break down that food. Um, and how this, of course, can lead to a buildup of toxins in the body, and that can eventually lead to cancer. Now, it's interesting he mentioned this back in the 90s, because now we live in a society that's a lot more health conscious. People these days, really try to avoid processed food and all these things. And then he starts speaking about meat, right? He starts talking about how there's hormones put into meat in order to make its shelf life longer, and how that, of course, also these types of hormones aren't healthy for human beings to consume. And so, probably the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is why is Imam Jamil talking about this? Or why is he talking about some of these unhealthy things we find in our food? He speaks about refined sugars, processed food, unnatural hormones being put in meat. Why is he talking about all of this? And he even talks about how the effects it has on the human body, right? And of course, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what's the point, right, in this particular book? And so he brings this up because he speaks about another aspect of fasting, which of course is when we fast, we are abstaining ourselves from what is typically halal, right, from food and drink. And, through doing so, it's Allah giving us a tool so we're able to control ourselves and be able to restrain ourselves from that which is society has made attractive to us, right? So he speaks about some of these different types of unhealthy foods that basically ask you a question, right? He gives us all these facts, and these are facts he mentions are kind of relatively known. And so he asks the question is, why does man choose to indulge themselves in these things, in unhealthy foods, in drugs, alcohol, all these things, when man knows that these things are unhealthy for him? He asked that question. That's kind of like what he was building up on when he starts bringing about these different points, right? Um, and he says that it's really due to the fact that society has made these things so attractive to us that even if we know that they're bad for us, we can't help but indulge ourselves in these things, right? And so from there he goes back into the discussion of the fitra, right? The innate belief of la ilaha illallah, right? And most of us here are familiar with, of course, the concept of fitra. And he starts discussing how Allah says how every human being is born ala fitra, born with this innate belief in la ilaha illallah, but it is of course their parents and society that changes their beliefs, right? Changes them into being a Jew, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, what have you, right? And that in order for man to get back onto that fitra, right, back onto that natural inclination towards la ilaha illallah, not only do they need to receive the message, but they have to take practical steps to maintain that belief, right? Hence, how fasting is a means for us to maintain our taqwa, our consciousness of God, even though this consciousness is something that's somewhat natural to us, right? And so he brings that back to the connection between, staying away from the importance of maintaining one's diet, and that staying away from these unhealthy foods and these unhealthy things through fasting. It can make it easier for us to stay focused and stay away from that which is forbidden for us. And on top of that, stay away from that is unhealthy for us, right? And staying away from that which is unhealthy for us is in and of itself a form of worship, right? He talks about how Allah tells us that He has made the halal for us what is pure and what is good, and as forbidden for us what is harmful for us, right? And he discusses how this is something that fasting is a means for us to discipline ourselves in having that mentality, staying away not only what is unlawful for us, but staying away from that which is unhealthy for us, and to maintain ourselves both spiritually and physically. And that's kind of where the chapter ends. for chapter 4. Now, of course, there are other points he makes in the chapter that I did not discuss just because I want to be able to have time for us to have a collective discussion. And those of you who are joining us through Zoom, please do, and if you're able to read the chapter beforehand, please do feel free to add any other points within the chapter you feel I didn't make. With that, we'll go ahead and end the live stream and start the discussion portion. Inshallah. اللهم سبحانه وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك